Fox News Podcast presents Bret Baier's All-Star Panel.
America's got to be in the lead if you want to deal with these threats. We're going to lead.
The mourning is over. The Shiva is done. And if you're a conservative, you should be optimistic.
You know, my main priority right now is making sure that it delivers for the American people.
We have to make our country great again, and I will do that.
I think the president gets criticized by people all the time for the stuff he says, by people who ignore what he does.
Now, Fox's chief political anchor, Bret Baier.
Monday, April 7th, marked another rocky day on Wall Street, with stocks drastically fluctuating following Tariff Liberation Day, as President Trump called it. This past weekend, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Secretary of Treasury Scott Bessent, and the Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick hit the airwaves to sell, or try to, a bold plan to a skeptical market and public.
There are 50, 60, maybe almost 70 countries now who have approached us. So it's going to be a busy April, May, maybe into June. And Japan is a very important military ally. They're a very important economic ally.
Meanwhile, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu met President Trump in the Oval Office Monday afternoon. For a conversation on this and more, we bring in our panel. Fox News radio political correspondent Jared Halpern, editor-at-large at The Spectator, host of the Ben Domenech podcast, Ben Domenech, and national security analyst and Democratic communications strategist Marie Harf. Jared, there's a lot of lawmakers jittery up on Capitol Hill after now the third down day, but this day had some ups and downs and maybe was not as bad as people predicted.
Well, part of the ups, I think, is because there seems to be an indication that perhaps these tariffs are not going to be quite as large, at least long term. And, today in the Oval Office, standing next to Benjamin Netanyahu, President Trump was sort of asked about the mixed messaging from administration officials. Are these negotiable? Are these permanent? And the president said that they could be both. He said, we're going to get fair deals and good deals with every country. And if we don't, we're going to have nothing to do with them. And they're not going to be allowed to participate in the United States. He went on to say that in some cases, countries will continue to pay substantial tariffs. But there does seem to be an openness to kind of have these tariffs be the high point and then see in the course of these negotiations, sort of country by country, if they can chip down either through rebalancing perhaps the trade surplus, the trade deficits, buying more American goods, lowering trade barriers for American products. That could take some time, though, Bret, and I think that's why you still see an awful lot of concern from lawmakers and certainly concern from investors.
Yeah, Marie, this is a big shift, and I think there was some skepticism, a lot of it, on the market that it was so big and that it was so kind of interestingly put together at the beginning as far as these equations. That said, the traditional political fallout, you talk to some union folks and they are fired up about the prospects here. You talk to, traditional Democratic groups and they think maybe this is going to work. The question is, how long is long enough before the fallout is too much?
And how much pain does President Trump want to inflict on the American people? You also had Mike Pence out this weekend saying that these were the largest peacetime tax hike in U.S. history. Mike Pence, who is by no means a liberal on these kinds of issues, economists will tell you they believe that if these tariffs move forward, small businesses will close, the American people will pay more for most things in their lives. And it's even more complicated, as you mentioned, because a lot of the equations and the numbers that were put out by the Trump administration at the beginning of this just did not match reality. There's this myth that President Trump believes in, that trade deficits are somehow always bad. And that's just not the case. It's been interesting that Elon Musk, a supporter of President Trump in so many ways, a close advisor, has been pretty negative on these tariffs online, on X. And it's caused a real rift in the Republican Party. Members of Congress who face voters in a mere number of months, it's not that far away, in the midterms, they are getting nervous. Traditional Republicans are and others understand that if they ran on lowering prices and President Trump does the opposite, which many experts across the political spectrum believe will happen if these tariffs go forward, that their voters will punish Republicans and that this is a self-inflicted wound that President Trump moved forward on because of his long-held belief that tariffs are somehow a good thing for economies, when most economists will tell you the opposite is just the truth.
Yeah, Ben, flip side here. The president is hinting that they are starting serious trade negotiations with Japan. He's authorized the Treasury Secretary to do that. And he's had calls with Vietnam and India and Argentina, and obviously met with Israel about going to zero tariffs both ways with those countries, or at least considering it. And that's a different ballgame.
Yes, but I think that one thing that we should keep in mind here is that, by tasking the Treasury Secretary with leading these negotiations, that's an admission on the part of the president that these are about negotiations, which seems to be something that is an item of dispute within the circle around him, including, I think, fostered by a number of people who would not like this to be a negotiation process situation. They would like it to be the reality, and the reality long term. You hear from the likes of Steve Bannon and from others, that this is something that they believe is going to remake everything. I think that instead, what we actually saw over the past couple of days is something that I and others have believed for a long time, which is that we had a significant amount of liquidity that was put into the market during COVID, and that led to a lot of speculation on things like we have not seen in the past to a greater degree than was justified, and that there was always going to at some point come a correction in that. What we didn't expect, of course, is that this would be the moment when the president would decide to do something this big. I think if you had gone into this administration, a lot of people would have predicted a trade war with China and with countries connected with China was very likely to occur at some point, and that was going to be something that the president has obviously telegraphed for a long time. Instead, in the old parlance, instead of declaring a trade war with just one country or with a couple of countries, he kind of declared it on the world, which is not exactly something that you can unswirl very quickly, especially if you're dealing in terms of bilateral talks that take time and effort and have to go through a process. Now, of course, this is the president's big bet. He's making this bet at a moment when a lot of people are uncertain about a lot of things going on in the world, and those include a key portion of his voters who are older and who are retired or about to retire, and who have their plans that they put in motion based on the market's performance over time and what that means for their retirement. Those are the people that I'm hearing from who are nervous, and I'm also hearing from the people in my generation who are concerned about what grandma and grandpa are going to be doing, and if they're going to be able to maintain themselves, because they don't have the same kind of timeline that a lot of working Americans have today in terms of the future. So this is, again, the president betting on his beliefs about tariffs, which run at odds with traditional Republican free market argument, and that's a bet that he's going to either win or lose at. It's just a question of how long we know until it's a win or a loss.
Yeah, Jared, meantime, there's efforts on Capitol Hill to try to thwart the president's tariff policies. And there are even 7 Republican senators who suggest that they would vote for it, Chuck Grassley being one of them. But the White House signaling that that would meet a veto threat, and the president, if it got through the House, which is doubtful it might, but it might, that the president would veto it.
Yeah, and it's unrealistic that it would get through either the House or the Senate with that veto-proof majority. And it shows, again, kind of over time, how the legislative branch is kind of ceded what traditionally had been a congressional oversight policy, tariffs and tax policy, to the executive. And President Trump is not the first president to wield an awful lot of influence as it relates to tariffs. And Congress has, up to this point, not done a whole lot to kind of rein in that power or reposition that power back towards Congress. Lawmakers seem to be most troubled with the tariffs on Canada. You've seen a lot of bipartisan concern with those, but again, does not seem to be at the level that would be needed to certainly override any sort of veto. And to your point, the House, especially House Republicans, seem pretty unified at this point to let this policy play out and give President Trump the runway here that he's asking for.
All right, we're going to take a quick pause here. We'll be back after this.
Last thing on tariffs, Marie, the China tariffs, where the president says that if they don't pull back their retaliatory 34%, China putting that on, that he is going to implement an additional 50%, which takes some Chinese goods up to 100% tariff by noon, April 9th. That's quite something. China can't really survive that long in a trade war environment because they import everything.
Look, I think there's a lot of consequences that would come from such extreme tariffs. You named one of them. There are a lot of goods that Americans would not be able to afford if we ratcheted up the trade war with China to that extent. But there's also evidence that the trade war is impacting other important issues. For example, the TikTok deal that Trump really wants to get done because he loves TikTok and a lot of his supporters are on TikTok. China said they won't negotiate over that deal, which they have to do in order to get an agreement here until this trade war has ended. So it will be interesting how the trade war spills out into other issues. On the flip side, another interesting negotiation Trump is involved in with Russia and Ukraine. He's looking for leverage over Russia to get this war ended, and yet didn't put any tariffs on Russia. Put more tariffs on an uninhabited island than he did on Russia, and there is room to do so. So I think that how this trade war plays out for the American consumer and the American public is a huge political piece of this. But it is going to start impacting other issues as well. He was meeting with Netanyahu today, the Israeli prime minister, to talk about a whole host of issues, but they had to talk about tariffs, even though they should have been spending all of their time talking about the war in Gaza, the threat of an Iran nuclear program. Tariffs now take up a lot of that oxygen. So it's a really messy picture when we're looking at global negotiations on this and other issues.
Yeah. And on the Netanyahu meeting, Ben, it seemed like Iran was a big focus. The president saying, really for the first time, that they are having and engaged in direct talks with Iran coming up this week, one-on-one talks to try to get to the table, negotiate something as opposed to green-lighting Bibi Netanyahu and the Israelis to go after nuclear sites.
I don't think that the president wants to have to do that, wants to have to go after Iran at this particular moment, especially just given the number of things that are on his plate. But I also think he's absolutely willing to do that if it does seem that there is no ability to have something that keeps the American side of things, that his advisors happy, keeps Bibi Netanyahu happy, and actually results in a real and measurable change in what the Iranians are doing. And so I think that this is a situation where we are at a higher likelihood of a strike than we've been in a very long time, and that the president is willing to go down that road. I'm not sure that he's on exactly the same page as Bibi at this point, but certainly I think we have to see every conversation that happens between them through that light, that there is a ticking clock on this, and that the president is certainly has a number of people in his cabinet who were more than willing to pull the trigger on this when they were representing them, when they were representatives and senators in Congress. And I think that that's something that has to be very credible in the mind of the Americans observing this.
Yeah, and Jared, we don't talk about it a lot. We have shown some of it, but the operation against the Houthis in Yemen, which are supported by the Iranians, is really kinetic. We just got a little peek from Defense Secretary Hegseth today in the Oval Office about these bombings happening pretty much daily by U.S. fighter jets and bombers in the region, taking out underground facilities, missile-making facilities, and troop locations to stop them from firing on U.S. naval warships.
And really all ships. I mean, this has been about freedom of navigation. President Trump has talked about that. Certainly when you fire on U.S. warships, you're going to get a response from the U.S., but it shows the kind of relentless attitude that the president and the Defense Department have taken. These strikes that got a lot of attention because of the signal leak have continued. There has not really been much of a step down in the way that those strikes against these Houthi targets in Yemen are being carried out. It is interesting that as those strikes continue is when President Trump announced what he said are going to be very high-level talks on Saturday with Iran and raised the stakes for it. He said in the Oval Office today that if these talks with Iran are not successful, he said Iran will be in great danger because they can't have a nuclear weapon. That sets a pretty high bar for these talks and certainly shows the seriousness of failure. There are going to be a lot of questions, I think, about what a final resolution looks like. Does it mirror at all the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal that the president withdrew the U.S. from during his first term? And what are kind of the conditions then for Iran, and what would it mean for Iran? Is this about sanctions relief? Is it about sort of a broader diplomatic outreach in that part of the world? It'll be interesting to see kind of what these talks look like on Saturday, who's involved, and what comes out of them.
Yeah, Marie, it's very complicated. It's like three-dimensional chess in the Middle East. It always has been. But Israel continues its operation against Hamas, which is also supported by the Iranians. Hezbollah has pretty much calmed down a bit, also supported by the Iranians. The Houthis supported by the Iranians. And now there is this negotiation, which we just don't know until it happens, what's going to come out of it.
Well, and what's so interesting, Bret, is the Iranians have been saying for months that they are unwilling to meet directly with the Trump team. So they have denied that there are any direct talks ever since Elon Musk went and met with the Iranians in New York, right, very soon after the election. And so it will be very interesting to see how they respond to President Trump sort of blurting out in the Oval Office that they will be meeting directly. Who is part of those talks? What do they look like? Where are they held? As someone who was involved in those talks back in 2013 and 14 and 15, all of those pieces of the negotiations really matter towards answering the question of whether you will get a deal. And it will be very fascinating to see what comes out of those. But Iran, in many ways, regionally, is much weaker than they have been in decades. The fact that Israel, with U.S. help, has been able to assassinate leaders of Hamas, leaders of Hezbollah, take these leaders off the battlefield, including attacking them in Tehran, right? I mean, that the success the Israelis have had is extraordinary in the last several years, taking out key parts of Iran's regional apparatus that has really waged so much war across the region. What Iran chooses to do next, whether they will come to the negotiating table, whether they will pull back some of that support because of U.S. and Israeli pressure, that's the million-dollar question. And it will be very interesting to see what, if anything, comes out of these very complicated, very difficult negotiations over Iran's nuclear program.
Yeah, and Ben, the president is getting ready to have his first foreign trip to Saudi Arabia, mid-May, and then Qatar, and then UAE. The hope was that Saudi Arabia was going to be the piece de resistance of negotiation between Putin and Zelensky. It does not seem like that's on track, at least not yet. But there's a lot to talk about with the Saudis and the Qataris and the Emiratis.
Yes, and I think that we're ramping up to a moment here where we're going to see whether the momentum that Donald Trump got when he arrived in January, coming off of that big win in the election, momentum that was unquestionable, has been dented by what's gone on this month. Meaning that has this trade war, the beginnings of it, essentially put him in a stronger position as it comes to relating and negotiating to these other nations, or has it put him in a weaker one? Has he already kind of exhausted the momentum that he certainly had when he came back to the White House? And that's, I think, an open question at this point. We're going to have to see what happens in the interim, but there certainly is much to talk about with all of those Middle Eastern nations and with their leaders. And yes, I think there was, some hope that they could play the kind of role that it seemed like they were tracking toward when it came to the Ukraine war. But unfortunately, I think that's not, as you say, in the offing at the moment.
All right, panel, thanks so much. This is one of my favorite weeks, actually. Now for a bit of history. On April 7th, 1963, then 23-year-old Jack Nicklaus won his first ever Masters tournament, finishing one stroke ahead of the runner-up Tony Lima. It was the second of his eventual record-setting 18 major championships. His third would come that July at the PGA Championship at the Dallas Athletic Club. Nicklaus will tee off as one of the honorary starters at this year's Masters on Thursday, as he always does, where the defending champion Scottie Scheffler is once again at least one of the favorites to compete and must possibly win. That'll do it for this week. You can hear more of this series at foxnewspodcast.com or wherever you download podcasts. Make sure to leave a rating and a review. We want to hear from you. For Ben, Jared, and Marie, I'm Bret Baier. We'll see you next time.
Listen ad-free with a Fox News Podcast Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.